He's had enough carbs today. Remove it, she snapped. Elena saw red. The kid hadn't touched his pasta. What kind of monster? But that wasn't the half of it. See, Victoria, the stepmother from hell, thought Elena was just some washed-up waitress. Wrong. Elena knew the signs. The pinched arm, the hushed threats. Her own stepfather had been a master of that particular brand of cruelty, and nobody ever believed her. That little boy, Lucas, he was trapped. Victoria thought she was so clever, putting on a show for the clueless dad. But Elena saw everything. Little does she know, Elena is about to show them all what quiet kindness is really capable of. She has no idea how her quiet kindness will change everything. The game is on. And Victoria? She's about to lose. Big time. Elena Martinez wiped down the mahogany tables at Grandview Restaurant for the third time that evening, her weathered hands moving with practiced grace. At 36, she'd been serving tables for nearly 2 decades, but tonight felt different somehow. The rain drummed against the tall windows as she glanced toward table 12, where a well-dressed man sat rigidly across from a woman whose diamond earrings caught the candlelight. Between them, a small boy with sandy hair picked at his untouched pasta, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. Elena had served thousands of families, but something about this child's quiet desperation tugged at her heart. She'd seen that look before in her own mirror years ago, when she was his age. The woman leaned forward and whispered something sharp to the boy, making him flinch. Elena's protective instinct stirred. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Elena had always believed that restaurants were like theaters, where real life played out over dinner plates. In her 20 years at Grandview, she'd witnessed proposals, breakups, business deals, and family reunions. But tonight, as she approached table 12 with their appetizers, she sensed something darker unfolding. The man introduced himself as David Harrison when she'd first seated them, his tired eyes suggesting someone carrying heavy burdens despite his expensive suit. His wife Victoria wore her beauty like armor, all sharp angles and cold smiles that never reached her eyes. But it was 8-year-old Lucas who captured Elena's attention. The boy sat perfectly still, his small hands folded in his lap, stealing glances at his father when he thought no one was looking. Elena recognized that careful behavior, that desperate need to be invisible. She'd perfected it herself as a child. "More bread for the table?" Elena asked warmly, placing the basket closer to Lucas. The boy's eyes lit up briefly before Victoria's icy voice cut through the moment. "He's had enough carbs today. Remove it, please." Lucas's face fell and Elena's heart clenched. She'd noticed he'd barely touched his meal, yet Victoria was denying him even a piece of bread. As the evening progressed, Elena found herself making extra trips past their table. Each time she witnessed small cruelties that made her stomach turn, Victoria would pinch Lucas's arm under the table when he reached for his water glass too quickly. She'd lean in close and hiss warnings that made the boy's shoulders tense. When Lucas accidentally knocked over his juice glass, Victoria's manicured nails dug into his wrist as she smiled apologetically at David. "Children can be so clumsy," she said sweetly. While Lucas bit his lip to keep from crying, David seemed oblivious, absorbed in his phone and the stress of whatever business crisis had his attention. Elena wanted to shake him, to make him see what was happening right in front of him. Didn't he notice how his son barely spoke? How the child flinched whenever Victoria moved too quickly? During her break, Elena stood in the kitchen doorway, watching their table through the service window. Lucas had dropped his napkin and was afraid to pick it up, his small body frozen with indecision. When he finally bent to retrieve it, Victoria grabbed his shoulder hard enough to leave marks, her smile never wavering as she spoke words that made the boy's face crumble. Elena had seen enough. She had grown up with a stepfather who perfected the art of public kindness and private cruelty. She knew the signs, knew the fear that lived in a child's eyes when they never knew which version of their guardian they'd encounter. Her own mother had been too tired, too beaten down to notice. But Elena was here now, and she wouldn't let history repeat itself. As she watched Victoria excuse herself to the restroom, leaving David buried in his phone and Lucas sitting alone with his pain, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She grabbed a warm chocolate chip cookie from the dessert station and approached their table, her heart pounding with the courage of someone who'd once been that frightened child and refused to let another one suffer in silence. Elena approached table 12 with the warm cookie, her hands trembling slightly. Lucas looked up at her with those haunted eyes that reminded her so much of her own childhood reflection. "This is on the house, sweetheart," she whispered, placing the cookie before him with a gentle smile. "Every brave boy deserves something sweet." The word brave seemed to puzzle Lucas, as if no one had ever called him that before. He glanced toward the restroom where Victoria had disappeared, then at his father, who was still engrossed in his phone call. With the careful movements of someone expecting punishment, Lucas took a small bite of the cookie. The first genuine smile Elena had seen all evening spread across his face. "It's really good," he whispered, and Elena's heart squeezed. Such a simple pleasure, and he was treating it like a precious gift. "What's your favorite subject in school?" Elena asked, crouching down to his level. She learned that getting children to talk about things they loved often brought light back to their faces. "I like to read," Lucas said quietly, "especially stories about dragons and knights. Dad used to read them to me before." He stopped abruptly, the light fading from his eyes. "Before what, honey?" Lucas glanced toward the restroom again. "Before Victoria said I was too old for bedtime stories. She says they make boys weak." Elena felt her blood run cold. What kind of person crushes a child's love of stories? She was about to respond when she heard the sharp click of heels on marble. Victoria was returning, her expression hardening as she took in the scene of Elena talking to Lucas. "Excuse me, but what is this?" Victoria's voice could have cut glass as she stared at the half-eaten cookie. "I brought it for Lucas," Elena said calmly, standing to face her. "All children should have a little sweetness in their lives. Lucas doesn't need cookies. He needs discipline." Victoria's fingers found the boy's shoulder, pressing hard enough to make him wuss. "And he certainly doesn't need strange women filling his head with nonsense." Elena watched Lucas's face close off, his brief moment of joy extinguished like a candle in a hurricane. The transformation was heartbreaking, the way he seemed to fold in on himself, preparing for whatever punishment awaited him later. "I was just being kind," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "Kindness without permission is interference," Victoria replied, her grip tightening on Lucas's shoulder. "Lucas, what do we say when people give us things we don't deserve?" The boy's voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you, but I can't accept it. If this moment of a child being denied simple kindness touches your heart, please give this video a thumbs up." Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can mean everything to someone who desperately needs to know they're not alone. Victoria's smile was triumphant as she watched Lucas push the cookie away, his small hands shaking. Helena realized she was witnessing more than just a strict parenting style. This was systematic emotional abuse designed to break a child's spirit and teach him that he deserved nothing good in life. The question that terrified her was simple. If Victoria was this cruel in public, what happened behind closed doors? The evening took a darker turn when David finally finished his business call and rejoined the family conversation. Elena was refilling water glasses at nearby tables, but her attention remained fixed on table 12. She watched Victoria seamlessly transform back into the doting stepmother, laughing at David's work stories and occasionally reaching over to smooth Lucas's hair with false affection. "How was dinner, buddy?" David asked his son, finally giving the boy his full attention. Lucas glanced nervously at Victoria before answering. "It was good, Dad. Thank you." "He's been such a perfect angel," Victoria cooped, her fingers resting possessively on Lucas's shoulder. "Never complained once, even when he was clearly tired." "Such a good boy," Elena wanted to scream. The woman was rewriting the entire evening, erasing her cruelty and replacing it with a fiction that David seemed eager to believe. She could see the exhaustion in the man's face, the weight of whatever responsibilities consumed his days. He was missing everything. When Victoria excused herself again, this time to take a phone call outside, Elena seized her chance. She quickly walked over to David, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Harrison, may I speak with you privately for just a moment?" David looked up, seeming to really see her for the first time all evening. "Of course. Is everything all right?" Elena glanced at Lucas, who was watching their interaction with fearful eyes. She knelt down next to David's chair, speaking quietly. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude, but I'm concerned about your son. I've been a waitress for 20 years, and I've learned to notice things." Lucas seems frightened. David's expression shifted from polite attention to confusion. Frightened of what? Of making mistakes, of reaching for things, of speaking up. Elena's voice trembled with the weight of what she'd witnessed. "Your wife has been quite harsh with him tonight when you weren't looking. She's pinched him, grabbed his wrist, threatened him under her breath." The color drained from David's face. He turned to look at his son. Really look at him, and Elena saw the moment recognition dawned. Lucas was sitting rigidly upright, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes darting toward the window where Victoria paced outside on her phone call. "Lucas," David said softly, "come here, son." The boy approached cautiously, as if expecting a trap. David gently took his son's hands, and Elena heard his sharp intake of breath when he saw the red marks on Lucas's wrist, where Victoria had grabbed him. "Who did this to you?" David's voice was barely controlled. Lucas's eyes filled with tears, but he glanced toward the window where Victoria's silhouette was visible. "I'm not supposed to tell," he whispered. "She says nobody would believe me anyway, and that you'd be angry if I caused trouble." Elena's heart shattered watching this father discover the truth about his son's suffering. She thought of her own childhood, of all the times adults had failed to notice or failed to act. But David was different. She could see the fury and protective love wearing in his expression. Have you ever had to find the courage to speak up for someone who couldn't speak up for themselves? It's one of the hardest things we can do, but sometimes it's the most important. Let us know in the comments if you've ever been in a situation like this. Victoria was walking back toward the restaurant. Her phone call finished, completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to crumble around her. Victoria returned to the table with her practiced smile, but it faltered when she saw David holding Lucas's small hands, examining the marks on his wrist with barely contained rage. Helena stepped back, her heart racing as she realized the confrontation was about to begin. "What's going on here?" Victoria asked, her voice carefully modulated. But Elena caught the flash of panic in her eyes. David stood slowly, his tall frame towering over his wife. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Lucas just told me something very interesting, Victoria. He told me about the things you say to him when I'm not around. About the ways you hurt him." "Hurt him?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and defensive. "Don't be ridiculous, David. Lucas is a sensitive child who has an active imagination. You know how children can be." "Show her your wrist, son," David said gently, never taking his eyes off Victoria. Lucas hesitated, clearly terrified, but his father's encouraging nod gave him strength. He held up his small wrist, revealing the angry red marks from Victoria's grip. Other diners had begun to notice the tension at table 12, conversations quieting as the drama unfolded. Victoria's mask finally slipped. "He bruises easily. He probably did that himself, playing too roughly." "I can't seriously believe I believe my son." David cut her off, his voice gaining strength. "And I believe this kind woman who had the courage to tell me what she witnessed." He nodded gratefully toward Elena, who felt tears prick her eyes at his words. The restaurant had grown quiet around them, but Elena could see this was far from over. Victoria's face had transformed into something ugly, her true nature finally exposed. "You're going to choose his word over mine?" Victoria hissed. "After everything I've done for this family, after I stepped in to raise your son, when his real mother abandoned you both?" Lucas flinched at the cruel reference to his deceased mother, and David's jaw clenched. "My wife died in a car accident, Victoria. She didn't abandon anyone, and you haven't raised my son. You've terrorized him." Elena watched as David knelt down to Lucas's level, his voice gentle despite his rage. "I'm so sorry, buddy. I should have seen what was happening. I should have protected you better." "It's okay, Dad," Lucas whispered, finally allowing himself to lean into his father's embrace. "I was scared you wouldn't believe me." The moment between father and son was so tender that Elena felt her own eyes fill with tears. This was what courage looked like. Both the courage to speak up and the courage to listen and believe. Victoria gathered her purse with sharp, angry movements. "You'll regret this, David. You'll come crawling back when you realize how difficult it is to manage a child alone. Hand you, she turned to Elena with venom in her voice. You had no right to interfere in our family. Someone had to, Elena replied quietly. That little boy deserves to feel safe and loved. If you've been enjoying this story and believe that every child deserves protection and kindness, please subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that remind us of the good in humanity. As Victoria stormed out of the restaurant, leaving a trail of shark whispers in her wake, Elena realized that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of courage and compassion. In the quiet aftermath of Victoria's departure, David sat with his arms around Lucas, both of them processing what had just happened. The other restaurant patrons gradually returned to their conversations, but Elena remained nearby, her heart still racing from the confrontation. She'd seen many difficult situations in her years of service, but few had ended with such clear justice. Dad. Lucas's voice was small but hopeful. Does this mean she won't be coming home with us? David's expression was firm but gentle. Victoria won't be living with us anymore, son, and she won't be allowed to treat you badly ever again. I promise you that. Elena watched as years of fear began to lift from the boy's shoulders. It was like watching a flower turn towards sunlight after a long, dark winter. Lucas straightened up, and for the first time all evening, he looked like the 8-year-old he was supposed to be. Elena, David said, turning to face her with gratitude shining in his eyes. I can never thank you enough for what you did tonight. You saved my son, and I failed to protect him myself. You're protecting him now, Elena replied softly. That's what matters. It takes courage to face hard truths, especially about people we thought we could trust. David nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Lucas, what do you say we properly thank the lady who looked out for you tonight? Lucas slipped out of his father's embrace and walked over to Elena. Without hesitation, he wrapped his small arms around her waist in a hug that melted her heart completely. Thank you for the cookie, he whispered, and for helping my dad see. Elena knelt down to his level one more time, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Oh, you were very brave tonight, Lucas. Remember that, and remember that you deserve kindness and cookies and bedtime stories about dragons and knights. Will you tell Dad that he used to read to me? Lucas asked hopefully. Maybe he can read to me again. I'd love to hear about those stories, David said, his voice thick with emotion. We have a lot of catching up to do, don't we, buddy? As Elena watched father and son walk out of the restaurant together, Lucas's hands secure in his father's, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She thought about her own childhood, about the adults who had failed to notice her pain, and felt grateful that tonight had ended differently for this precious boy. 3 months later, David and Lucas returned to Grandview Restaurant, but this time, they weren't running from problems. They were celebrating. Lucas had joined the school's reading club and had made his first real friend. David had cut back on his work hours to spend more time with his son. They'd both learned that healing takes time, but love and attention can work miracles. Elena, Lucas called out when he spotted her, his face beaming with the confidence of a child who finally knew he was safe and loved. As she served them dinner that night, Elena reflected on how one moment of courage had changed 3 lives forever. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. If you enjoyed this story about finding courage to protect those who need it most, please remember to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts about standing up for others, and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the power of human compassion. Thank you for taking this journey with us tonight.